Back to Syria on the strategic chessboard. Americans in particular are prone to think about international politics as a series of discrete problems susceptible to discrete solutions. It's not by accident that we're often referred to as Mr. Fix-It. I think it was my old professor, Henry Kissinger, who quipped that Europeans think of problems as conditions to be endured. Americans think they're opportunities for inventive solutions. Having once tried to solve an issue and failed, Europeans never forget it, conclude it's unsolvable, and thus don't try again. In contrast, Americans have no memory, Henry says. So even though we've tried to do something once, twice, three times, we keep trying, and sometimes that persistence succeeds. So as you look at this problem, the temptation to not just stand there but do something seems overwhelming, especially for Americans, even if we can't quite figure out what to do.
And this may be one of those rare cases where President Obama is acting in some ways more like a European. He's thinking about all of the times the United States has tried and failed with these issues before, and he's very hesitant to go in and get involved. So,
well, you remember in the campaign he was accused of being French.
That's right. Well, you know, in this case, the French have gone in and intervened more than the United States has. So let's go to one of your favorite tropes, Graham, which is let's look at Syria by the numbers. So first, its size is 185,000 square kilometers. That's slightly larger than North Dakota, but its population is 22.5 million. That's a whole lot bigger than North Dakota. The population density is about 121 people per square kilometer, and that tells you right away, just given the number of people who live in the cities, it's about a little over half the country lives in the cities, that this is a very different problem than Libya was. Remember, in Libya, you could go out and send in fighters, fighter bombers, aircraft to go take out the Libyan government forces before they took over a city. In Syria, the problem has been much of the fighting's happening right inside the cities, so it's not as if you can go in and attack. There have been 100,000 casualties so far, battle casualties, by the UN's own estimate, probably more than that, in fact. That, again, is very different than Libya, where in the end there were maybe 10,000 or 15,000, and that was seen as reason for U.S. action. The externally displaced population, if you just go to the UN humanitarian arm, the Committee for Refugees, is 1.9 million. But
that has been chased out of Syria.
Chased out of Syria. It means they're living in Turkey, they're living in Jordan. But internally, there have been another 4 million plus displaced. In 2011, just as the war was getting going, the GDP in Syria was $108 billion. That is a tiny GDP, and I'm often reminded of the fact that if you go back to the 1950s, Syria and South Korea had about the same size economy. Today, South Korea is in the list of top 10 or so economies in the world. The GDP per capita in Syria, again 2011, before the war really got going, was just a little over $5,000, yeah. Right? The country is 90% Arab, it's 9% Kurd. And the religious groups, it is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, 74%. 11% are Alawite Shia, but of course, President Assad and the forces around him that have controlled Syria for all these years are the Alawites. So the country has been run by a leadership group that represents fully 11% of the population, and you know what that means when revolution happens.
When the Alawites are actually a Shia offshoot.
They are, and thus supported by the Iranians, and of course they have been important to Iran. 10% of the country is Christian, 3% is Druze, and then 2% others, mostly Shia. So that's Syria by the numbers, and it gives you the beginnings, just the beginnings of an understanding about how complicated this is.
And it's a good lesson, I think, for all of us when thinking about a country to start off by just seeing, can we do it by the numbers? So you get a sense how big it is, how many people, how are they spread out, what are the circumstances. The next on my checklist when I'm doing locating a country on the strategic chessboard is to ask the question, well, what about where are they geographically? What about a map? Most Americans have difficulty with geography, as we know from these quizzes that are given from time to time. So let me ask the students here, how many countries abut Syria? That is, how many countries share a border with Syria? Anybody have a guess?
6.
6, okay, any other?
I thought it was
I think it's only 5.
5, how about any other numbers?
I was going to say 5.
Well, let's see.
And the Mediterranean.
Okay, let's start down the list. Who can name abutters? So,
Israel.
Turkey.
so wait, Israel, okay. Turkey,
Jordan.
Jordan,
Lebanon.
Lebanon.
Iraq.
It's good to see what Syria, who are the immediates around, and where is it located on the larger strategic chessboard. And particularly when thinking about a specific country like Syria and what to do, one should notice that kind of everything is connected to everything else, and the more intimate the connection, the more direct the countries that are immediately or abutters are impacted by refugees, by people seeking sanctuary, by the supply of arms. So I would say that's the next big picture.
Well, it is, Graham, but it's also, again, worth comparing this to Libya, a big country, but a lot of desert, not much population. And while it certainly has, abutting neighbors, it doesn't have neighbors who strategically fit into the American picture as closely as those in Syria. So just think of your list. Israel, no closer ally in the Middle East, and perhaps few closer allies anywhere in the world. Jordan, whose stability is incredibly important to the United States. Iraq, we just spent a past decade trying to stabilize Iraq.
About $3 trillion.
And $3 trillion, or just about. And so if Syria explodes and takes the explosion elsewhere, it could undo whatever was done in Iraq, and there's a lot of concern about Iraq undoing itself anyway. So it's a very different calculus for the president than Libya was. It's even a different calculus for any president than any of the other interventions that the U.S. has had in recent times.
So to make it even more complicated, and what's happening in Syria is also connected, obviously, to what's now called the Arab revolutions, which started as the Arab Spring. Initially, a largely peaceful uprising toppled Tunisia's authoritarian leader, Ben Ali, in January of 2011. Then, to many analysts' surprise, Egypt followed, with Mubarak gone out by February. Then the governments of Libya and then Yemen were also toppled before year's end. So many people said Arab Spring is blooming and this is going to happen everywhere, and Syria was just another part of that picture.
Well, it's a reminder, Graham, that our predictive capabilities are not that great. Or as Yogi Berra once famously said, predictions are risky things to make, especially about the future. So President Obama, when Tunisia blew up, had an intelligence briefing one day, and he asked his briefer, what are the chances this could spread to Egypt? This was late 2010. And he was told, about 20%, sir. And a month later, Egypt was up in flames, and of course, Syria and others went along. Then we have the question of peaceful revolutions. I mean, there was a thought that there would be peaceful revolutions happening first in Egypt, then in Bahrain, another key U.S. ally, the home of the Fifth Fleet. And the hope in the White House at that time was that Assad would fall about as quickly as Mubarak had.
And then the policy was announced, and President Obama, one of his refrains is, and the Europeans' refrain is, Assad must go, because they thought he was going. So how's that working out?
Well, that's a great question, and since I don't want to answer it, I think that we ought to ask all of you. So what's this tell us about how well policymakers can sort of both predict and guide their own future in dealing with these? Andrew?
I'd say that the governments and especially the public are very impatient. They expect things to happen very quickly, for revolutions to be succinct and quick. And as we're seeing in Egypt right now, they're undergoing what some people are calling a counter-revolution. And the underlying fact is that if we look at past revolutions, if you date back to the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, things that started with euphoria and looked like things would go, like there would be a smooth transition, ended up taking years or decades.
Well, Rebecca, you spent a lot of time thinking about state building. So how do you build stable states, which the United States kept announcing it was going to do in the first 6 months of the Arab revolutions, if your ability to predict what Andrew called quite accurately counter-revolutions is this bad?
Well, I mean, the state building literature, there's arguments that say, can you build states quickly or not? And, most people come out on the side of not. And they'd say, like, historically, if you look at Europe, or places where we have really strong states that have democracies, et cetera, and we don't expect to topple, they had decades of state building that were predicated on years of basically civil war, of expanding your control from the center, taking taxes from the populations that you then used to bolster your military, so you then could patrol better and tax better. And then eventually, over time, those citizens start demanding that you provide some services for them. Plus, it's convenient for you if they all speak the same language and can, come work, et cetera, et cetera. And so then, you have these strong states. But that clearly doesn't really match with what we're seeing happening. And, what are you going to do? Say, okay, we'll just let you guys work it out on your own?
I think what that cuts to is a misunderstanding of incentives, which I think is something that definitely happened in Egypt and that we're seeing the ramifications of now, and that certainly happened in Syria as well. And one of the unique elements of the Syria conflict, to me, compared with some of the other Arab Spring cases we've considered, is that the longer it drug on, there is this 10% group of Christians who have depended upon the Assad regime for their security. And then, there are the Alawites, many of whom support Assad. And some people were on the fence at the beginning, but the longer a conflict drags on, the more that support base becomes solidified and hardened. And so I think it becomes harder and harder, if it's not a quick regime change, to see any kind of movement one way or the other.
Well, so Jess, the lesson from this seems to be, if we try to execute these quickly, as we attempted in Iraq and Afghanistan, hold elections in a hurry before a state is built, you frequently fail.
How about Egypt?
If you try to do it slowly, sometimes it never gets traction.
I would say that the bottom line for this one for me is Andrew's earlier point. If you think about revolutions in history, a great study that's part of the supplementary reading for this week is Crane Brenton's book called Anatomy of a Revolution. And there's 10 wonderful takeaways, but the most important one of which is that revolutions are not short. The first phase of euphoria is usually the first chapter in a long book. And the chapters that follow go through lots of twists and turns, mostly unpredictable and unpredicted. Now he's then tries to create a little bit of an anatomy. But if we go back to the French Revolution, one of the paradigm of this, in 1789, you get this rush of euphoria declaring the toppling of the king and liberty, equality, fraternity. Those were the banners. Within 2 years, you had set up a guillotine in the Place de Concorde, right in the middle of Paris, and you're starting chopping heads, including the king. Pretty soon, the chopping turns on the revolutionaries themselves, and Robespierre was in line, and thousands of people are killed elsewhere. And before the decade is out, a guy who was a colonel when all this started, who was leading French forces into Egypt to show French power, a guy named Napoleon, declares himself to be emperor and goes about putting together a pan-European empire and was making pretty good progress until 1815, when comes Waterloo, and you get So that's a long time. If you have to ask, how long is it from 1789 to 1815 in current historical, this story will be going on in, what is it, 2041?
Well, I think you now see why President Obama, whenever he is asked about why the U.S. is holding back so much, frequently invokes the American Revolution and points out, again, 1789, another big year. But from that point forward, the United States, 60 years later, finds itself in the midst of a huge civil war.
And I think one more point to add, if we were having this conversation a couple of years ago, there would have been a lot of criticism of our even using the word revolution to describe what was going on in the Middle East at the time. At least in the academic sphere, there were a lot of questions of, does this constitute an ideological change full enough to actually qualify it as a revolution, which is one reason that the name the Arab Spring, the names the Arab uprisings became commonly used. And to your point about the French Revolution, I think the points that came up at the time were essentially for that full ideological change to take place, it often takes a lot of time and a lot of conflict. And if we look back at the French Revolution and other past cases, that's what it's required. So that may be what we're witnessing.
Okay, well, I think that,
That's a pretty good summary, and so I think
not a very optimistic summary. but,
certainly not. So in the next segment, we'll go on and ask ourselves an even tougher question. So if the U.S. intervened successfully to prevent a mass slaughter in Libya, did so in Bosnia in the 90s, why not Syria?